Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to host-tune-perform.com. This is your favorite Anand Goel, and in this series, we will be covering and talking about Docker. So my agenda for the series is to make sure that you understand Docker and like why it is so famous. So we will not be talking about Kubernetes in this series. We will be talking only about Docker. If you learn Docker, then you should go next for Kubernetes and like some other orchestration engine, maybe AWS or maybe something else. That is out of the scope of this series. This series will be very short, having approximately 6 to 8 videos only. So just like before I start up with what exactly is Docker, when I started up reading Docker, maybe like say a few years back, I read a line saying that Docker are containers. Obviously, yes, yeah, Docker are containers, but like at that time when I started reading up Docker, so it was very confusing for me to understand what exactly is a container or what exactly is the image or how exactly these containers works. So like to understand Docker, at first we need to understand how exactly our software industry works. So for this I have, like you can see over here, I have like made up an image, and in this image at the very top we have this part. I am just marking it right for you. So this is the part which will make sure that you understand how exactly products are delivered and products are being like tested in real time. But like what all things are required to build up a product. So whenever a person builds up a product, he or she is required to make sure they understand in what technology the product is built in. So the product can be made like the same video editing software can be made in .NET. You can make it using Java. You can make it using C++, which is obviously the best option because C++ have a lot of like library files available already available, and you do not need to work on them. So at first the product is created by a company, and then like that particular product is installed on various environments. So one is the production environment, second is the performance environment, third is the automation testing environment, and like fourth can be a miscellaneous environment, or like we can keep an extra environment with very low configurations so that we can distribute it with like or like make it reusable within the team of testers, or maybe the developers can use them. And also we have the dev environment, which is obviously on their system itself, like the developers create up the environment on their system. So what exactly is an environment? So environment is something, at first whenever you deliver a product, it is necessary for you to make sure that you choose an operating system for that product. So when you say that Naukri.com, so Naukri.com is a website which runs on web, but it has been hosted on some operating system. That operating system can either be Windows, or that operating system can be Linux, right? So this is the first step, like we choose the operating system. So after choosing the operating system, we like see like if we have all the prerequisites installed on our computer system. So whenever we install a product, so I used to work in a company where we used to work in financial markets, and we have had a like a product which was a warehouse product, and that product was built upon .NET. And as it was built upon .NET, so like there was a requirement for us to, like whenever we used to install that product, so like what our developers used to do is like they used to give us an installer .msi installer. So we just need to like double click on that installer, then next, and like the paths to all the like files where they will be stored, and the product used to get installed. So this was the way like we were installing the product. But before installing that product, there was a huge list of prerequisites, right? So whenever we used to install this particular software on our system, we used to give some prerequisite. So for .NET users, so if you are a .NET developer, you must know it, like whenever you develop .NET or like install a product, you need to install few prerequisites such as .NET hosting, .NET services, then .NET framework. So there are a lot of prerequisites. Then C++ distributions were also used, Visual Basic C++ distributions. So similarly, there are a lot of prerequisites. Some applications even use Hyper-V, which is for virtualization itself. So there are like there were a lot of prerequisites which were used, which we need to install before we install the product, because these prerequisites are actually the technologies which are being used. So when you say you are installing .NET hosting, it means that you can use a lot of code in developing up your software, like which has a runtime environment known as .NET hosting, right? So similarly, for prerequisite, if an application is on Node.js, you need to install Node.js. If you are just installing a website, say Naukri.com, so they must install PHP server, right? If you are installing a database, then you should install a database server. IIS is already installed on systems on Windows. IIS is only for Windows. Then we might need to install Java and some other applications. So this was the way which was like, which is done in, even now these things are done in the industry. So we need to install the prerequisite, and at the end either we copy paste the product files. So these are the product files. If you are having a PHP servers, you should have PHP files. If you are having a Node.js, then you should have JS files. If you are like doing some web work, you can even have CSS files. Then servlets is again for Java, MySQL scripts for database, MySQL database, it is not mentioned here. So these are the product files. So these are your product files, and these are the technologies involved. This middle one is are the technologies involved. So when you have installed the prerequisites and then finally you install your product files or copy paste your product files to make a particular server run that product, right? So these are the process which are being followed in day-to-day life for installing a software, a product which is owned by a company. Now, this thing was to be done by the developer. This thing was to be done by the tester. This thing was to be done by the DevOps engineer. This thing was to be done by any other person. So this was the same thing which was done by everyone. So there were two ways, like in the companies. They either used to keep up a person who used to install them on different environments, and he used to maintain those environments. Again, that was a cumbersome task, and the particular person who was required to maintain all these things was very costly, because he used, like, we required a person who knows all of these technologies, who knows the relation between technologies, who know, like, when we install a prerequisite, he should know what kind of prerequisite has been installed, and like what kind of prerequisite is required by the product, right? So this is the current way of working. Now let us understand how exactly Docker is helping us in this process. So rather than like having all people install the product on their system, like first person goes, open up the operating system, install the prerequisites, then he install the product files, then he copies the product's data from some location to his system. So these are the steps, and like while doing up these steps, people used to make mistakes, and this was very time consuming, and that's why it was very costly. So this is the place where like Docker comes into picture, and like what exactly is done is like all these prerequisites and all these installations are being written as commands in a file called as Docker file. So Docker file has do not have any extension, I guess. You can go ahead and check it yourself. So all of these things are written in a Docker file, and there is a Docker engine, a software which executes these files. So now people do not have to individually install these prerequisites on the system, and hence the chances of making of mistakes reduces. They just write all these things in a Docker file, and this Docker file is actually written for a server. This is written for a server, for any like any server, maybe a web server, or it can be a app server, or it can be both web and app server. So this Docker file is written for that particular server. So in this similar way, a Docker file will be written for a database server, right? So these Docker files are written, and these Docker files are then passed for processing to the Docker engine, and Docker engine is something which is installed on the operating system. So it can be Windows or Linux. We just need to install Docker. We do not need to manage all the prerequisites. We do not need to manage all the product files. Our person who is managing the environment just need to learn Docker. All the other work inside Docker, like what things will be written inside this Docker file, should be done by the developer. The developer builds up this path, so now the person who is like maintaining the environment does not need to have all these knowledge, and hence we can have a person like even with lesser salary, right? So he will install Docker on Linux or Windows, and then he will just pass this Docker file to that particular Docker engine, and then that Docker engine will know, okay, he wants to install a Node.js server, he wants to install Java, he wants to install Django, all these things, and then he will install, then the Docker engine will install all of these prerequisite operating system and everything, and your system will be ready to work. So this is what like the main advantage of Docker file is. But now what about the product files? When we say that we have installed the system, say Naukri.com has been installed, but when you go ahead and open up Naukri.com, it will be empty, right? So there will be a lot of product file and data files, right? All these PHP files, .js files, CSS files, script files, these all things cannot be contained in a Docker file, right? But we can write up a command, say copy command. So copy command is a CMD command. So we will write up a copy command in this Docker file, which will say that these files, all these product files are present on my system. They are present on my system. Just copy them from my system to the container. This is a image file. Whenever we run an image, it becomes a container. So the only difference between image and container is this. This is an image file. When we run this image file, it becomes a container, right? So now all these files will be copied to this Docker file, and now your Naukri.com will work as usual. So this copying of this file is usually time consuming, but as the commands has already been written in the Docker file, you just need to make sure that these files are present on your system, right? So there are two ways actually like of like using up your product files. We will not go very deep into this as of now. Just try to understand the structure and the need of Docker, and why exactly like the Docker became so famous. So there is one more point which I want to discuss with you today is like why exactly Docker became so famous. There was one more technology which was very close to the same architecture, same structure, which is like virtual machines. So you can create up the images of virtual, like you can create up the image of a virtual machine, and like you can reuse them. That requires Hyper-V. That is what we were talking about few minutes back. But how exactly is Docker different from those VM images? The first point is like Docker contains everything in layers. So whenever you create up this Docker file, it is just a text file. It is a very short text file. So you say from is actually used to select the operating system. So you say from alpine. What is alpine? Let us discuss this word. What is alpine? That is ALPIN, and last is E. I am going very slow with this word. There is a reason. Alpine. You will encounter this word again and again while using up Docker. Alpine is nothing but a Linux operating system having very less like the front end implementations. It is, that's why it is very like of very less size. So it is a Linux operating system, and it does not gives you all the features of Linux. So whenever we install a server, we do not require those features, right? So in Windows or in Linux, we have a lot of features. We can use the webcam, we can use the keyboard, we can use the mouse, we can use the CD drive, we can use the USB drive, then we can use the network, then we can attach external hard disk with the system. So there are a lot of functions which can be done within an operating system, and these all functions are not required by all the softwares. Nokia.com, what is the use of attaching a hard drive or a USB if we are running a Nokia.com server, right? So all of these things are removed from this version of Linux, which is Alpine, and that's why it becomes very less. So whenever we write a Docker file, we say from Alpine. This is the word. This is the command from Alpine. So whenever we say from Alpine, Docker file knows that the operating system which is to be used is Alpine, right? So this is the way like a Docker file is like used, and like I just like and this from Alpine is particularly giving us the operating system, and then after that we give a command for installing of the prerequisites. Now Alpine is a separate image which is being which is already stored in the Docker images. So there is something called as hub.docker.com. So it contains the pre-images. So Alpine is already the image. So when we say from Alpine, it will like install Alpine from that image. So it will not create an image or like save a particular image specific to you. So it has a layered system, and that's why it becomes like very fast. Like whenever you install something on Docker, like uh, even for the first time, it is faster than the basic virtual machines or like the images, because it follows a structure which contains layers. Mean from Alpine is already present, install that, then install the prerequisites, that is Java, then this. So this is a layer. So it has few images which are already saved with it, and like it uses that, and then over that image it runs these commands for installing of the prerequisites. So as of now, just do not try to think so much. Just try to understand the concept, why Docker was built and what exactly is the use of Docker. So just before I go ahead and close up this session, there is one more thing which I want you to understand, or like at least know at the very beginning of this series, is Docker Compose. What exactly is Docker Compose? So you see over here that we have two files. One is Docker file for web and app, which is here, and second is the Docker file for database, which is here, right? So we have two servers. In the similar way, a product can have n servers. It can have two database server, two app server, two web server, and exactly like so many things, right? So either we maintain a file for each of them and run each of them separately using the command line, which again will go and will be passed by the Docker engine, or else we can keep all of them. Obviously we require them, we can keep all of them, but we mention the name of all of these files into another file. So there is a ladder now. These docker files contains information about a single server. This Docker Compose, so Docker Compose is again a file. So Docker Compose is again a file. This Docker Compose file contains all these Docker files. If we have n Docker files, n servers, so it will contain information about all this. Docker Compose is actually the composition of all the Docker files. So instead of like running each of these files separately using the Docker engine, we will say we will just run a single file which is Docker Compose, and it has again 9 files. So Docker engine will know at first it has to use Docker file number 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, then 8, and in these Docker files you have the server on which these all things have to be installed, right? So again, like the things, I do not want you like the things to become complex for you. So whenever we have multiple servers, multiple containers running simultaneously, then we require to manage the communication between each of them. And this communication which is being managed between each of them is known as orchestration. And this is why Docker Swarm or Kubernetes are required. So this brings this chapter to the close, and in the next chapter we will be installing Docker on Windows. So let's hope I will be able to give you good glimpse and make your career move ahead. Thank you guys. Have a great